Hello, History 132 students. Hope everything is well and things are going fine with you. Uh, Once again, we are in the third week of this semester, and in your class, we're doing chapter 20 entitled Africa and the World. It covers the time period between 1400 and 1800. Now, remember what we are dealing with here, the geography. Africa is a continent made up of many diverse groups of people. Uh, but what we want to get across to you today is the African states, identify them around 1400 up into the modern period. Uh, but what we want to also get across is the kingdoms that was in existence during this particular time. But the Europeans' intrusion in Africa began in the 15th century, and I think we've already talked about this with the Portuguese. And of course, they was followed by the French, the British, the Germans, the Dutch, and of course the Belgians in occupying land on the continent of Africa. However, uh, the thing that reverts to me is the transatlantic slave trade in our history. Now, let's go back, say, to about 600 AD, 700 AD to about 1400. Mainly, the African contact beneath the Sahara was done with Muslims, and this facilitated the trans-Saharan trade with the Muslims or the Berbers, trading in gold, cola nuts, ivory, and of course precious minerals like diamonds and gold, and human cargo, slaves. So slaves are not, slavery in Africa is not new. It had been around since man had been around. But what I want to get across to you is that the trans-Saharan slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade are different. Of course, you're going across the desert and the trans-Saharan slave trade, and across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade. Um, so, the intrusion of the transatlantic slave trade forced one of the greatest migrations in world history, through which Africa made a substantial involuntary contribution to the building of the West industrial civilization. We talked about the desire for sugar in Europe resulted in the increased demand for slave labor in South America and in the southern United States. In the 18th century, Western technology change created demand for cotton and other crops, which required more human cargo. Uh, Between this 15th and 16th century, in total, up through the 17th century, about 10 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, first to work on the sugar plantation and then later the cotton plantation, the institution of slavery. Now, how did this phenomenon occur? Well, first of all, other Africans sold spoils of war, which included human cargo, to the Europeans, and thus began the transatlantic slave trade. Uh, and some kingdoms that were very powerful became very wealthy behind this trafficking in human cargo. Uh, the kingdom in Benin, which is in modern day Nigeria, comes to mind. Uh, we also see trade going on throughout the continent, but this trade disrupted Africa. Now, but it also created and exchange of goods and ideas that even survive today. I loaded a PowerPoint slide on Africa. I want you to pay close attention to the Columbian exchange. This is the exchange between the Europeans and African and Asian, and where the vast number of products came from, like the horse from Europe and Asia, not native of America. The pig from Europe, not America. But we also see disease like syphilis in America, but typhoid, smallpox, you name it. And this is what decimated the Native American population once they came in contact with the Europeans, because they did not have an immunity to the disease introduced by the Europeans. And so this decimated the Indian Native American tribe that they came in contact with, and led to the importation of Africans to do the work to build this industrial society of America, the West, Brazil, you name it, South America and North America. But make sure you go back to your PowerPoint slide. I'm going to reload it and look at that Columbian exchange and get an idea of what transpired over this broad period. Now, of course, slavery was introduced in America in 1619. You're familiar with this, the American 1619 project. But the institution of slavery had always existed. But this transatlantic slave trade is how my ancestors and your ancestors got here. And of course, the European settlers first enslaved the indigent people. These are the Native Americans. That system did not work. They would either run off or commit suicide. They refused to be enslaved. So next, the Europeans turned to Africans. First, they was adapted to the tropical climate, which they were going to be forced to live in, and it facilitated. Now, the British outlawed the slave trade, I believe, in 1803. So slavery became a domestic product after 1803. Very few ships made it from the African continent to the Americas. Now, the last slave ship to land in America was here in Alabama, in Mobile, the Clotilda. That would be a wonderful topic if you're going to do research on your research paper. So what else do I need to tell you? We know about the dreaded passage, the Miller Passage, and we know about the control by wealthy shipping families and, of course, wealthy African kingdoms. So capitalism drove the transatlantic slave trade and the trans-Saharan slave trade. Now, there's something else you need to remember on this slave trade of Africans. The Muslim slave trade, in their religion of Islam, the Quran forbade the enslavement of fellow Muslims. Once the African converted to Islam, they were no longer slaves. And so they were integrated into the Arab communities. That's why you see Arabs with big, thick lips, big nose, Negroid features, hair. So these cultures merged. Now, in the Americas, it was the opposite. Just because the slaves converted to Christianity, it did not change their status. In the Middle East and North Africa, once you converted to Islam, you were no longer a slave. In the Americas, once you converted to Christianity, you still remain a slave as well as your descendants. So, in summarizing this, well, demographic. Did the slave trade have on Africa? Between approximately 1500 and 1866, now this is important, the Civil War ended slavery in America in 1865. I think in Brazil in 1880, Cuba's later. So slavery in the Americas went on throughout the 19th century. Between 1501 and 1866, more than 12 million African was forcibly exported to the Americas. 6 million were traded to Asia, and 8 million were retained as